First World War began on the 28th of July 1914 as a localized military conflict between two European nations, namely Austria-Hungary and Serbia. However, when Germany declared war against Russia on the 1st of August 1914, it was transformed into a pan-European struggle. Eventually, it became a global war involving 32 nations. 28 of these nations, including Great Britain, France, Russia, Italy, and the United States of America, were known as the Allies and the Associated Powers. Germany, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria opposed the coalition and were known as the Central Powers. The United States of America not only sent a large number of men and huge quantities of war material to Europe, but also helped her allies with money. After the war, when she demanded the money back, the European powers refused. This refusal was one of the contributory factors that led the United States of America from her surging prosperity of the 1920s to the Great Depression of the 1930s. President Hoover was unable to handle the crisis and let America slip into a hopeless situation where stock markets crashed and poverty triumphed. Discontent against Hoover's presidency ran so high that shelters for the homeless began to be named Hooverville, and empty pockets turned inside out were dubbed Hoover flags. Dr. Chitto Protopalit points to certain measures that the United States of America adopted to fight the economic depression.
First of all, there had to be some compromise between plenty and poverty. This was an internal problem in the United States. Some people were stinking rich, whereas majority of the people were very poor. So that problem was there. Another problem was that there had to be a balance between agriculture and industries. There was too much of industrialization, and agriculture was sadly neglected. And everyone knows that the nation thrives on rural surplus, and that somehow was abandoned. There was an overemphasis on industrial production. The third area which could be tackled was some kind of assurance to the public, the people at large, that they were not going to be marginalized, particularly women, children, old people, poor labor. These are the categories who were being systematically marginalized. There should be social legislation for the protection of the general people. That was there. At the same time, to save American industries, save business. So, not that all business or industry should be shut down and only the common people had to be protected at all costs. Both sides had to be safeguarded. That was the goal of the progressive movement. It all started with Theodore Roosevelt in the first phase, who offered what is known as square deal. He also indulged in what is called trust busting, the monopolies of big companies and the trusts, and also passing some social legislation for the protection of the poor. Historians have debated it. They say that this measure was not so much pro-people, it was pro-capitalist. It was whole purpose was to offer some kind of a life belt to the capitalists. But be that as it may, the debate is still on, but that was the first phase. After his period, there was again the emergence of selfishness, emergence of the triumph of private capitalism, etc. And people were neglected, and therefore there was an absolute necessity for a revival of the progressive program, which we see in the time of Woodrow Wilson, who actually gave another deal measure known as New Freedom. In New Freedom, we mainly have emphasis on agriculture and emphasis on social securities, and we also have some amount of control of the trusts and monopolies. At the world stage also, Woodrow Wilson had taken the message of 14 points. The main purpose of 14 points was to allow self-determination to many of the colonized people. So everywhere, whether at home or abroad, the New Freedom program, which was the kingpin of progressive era, was also tremendously successful. And then again, there was a slump of complacence. Hoover and Coolidge had come over with the roaring 20s of absolute brash capitalism and profiteering. And once again, all the opportunities for common people created by Woodrow Wilson were frittered away, and there was a triumph of capitalism in America. But the rosy picture was no longer there very much because of this uncontrolled capitalism and overproduction. The depression had set in. So who would bell the cat? Who would come as president to save America at this critical point? And they were looking for a messiah, and they found a person who was equal to the task. This person was Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States of America, was one of the most skillful political leaders of the 20th century. Such was his reputation that he was elected for an unprecedented fourth term in 1944. Born at Hyde Park, New York on the 30th of January 1882, he was the only child of James Roosevelt and Sarah Delano Roosevelt. His father, who was once a railway executive, was a cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, the 26th President of the United States of America. Although they were not wealthy by late 19th century standards, the Roosevelts led a comfortable, gracious existence. Young Franklin's life was adequately sheltered. A handsome youth, he was an excellent athlete, expert at boating and swimming, and a collector of stamps, birds, and model ships, hobbies that he pursued all his life. His formal education began at the Groton School in Massachusetts, where the headmaster, Endicott Peabody, stressed to his affluent young students their obligation towards those who were less fortunate in society. After graduation from Harvard University in 1904, Roosevelt attended Columbia University Law School without taking a degree, and was admitted to the New York State Bar in 1907. In 1905, despite his widowed mother's objections, he married a distant cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt, in a gala society wedding at which President Theodore Roosevelt gave the bride away. He had served as an assistant secretary in the Wilson cabinet. He had been the leader of the federal legislature for quite some time on the Democratic platform. So, he had all these experiences plus his erudition to support him. He had suffered in his childhood from infantile polio, was partially incapacitated, and moved in a wheelchair with a crutch in his hand. But he was a bundle of energy when it came to matters of public life. Unfortunately, he died in 1945 without completing even a year of his fourth term. He has been a connoisseur for many a historian of the 20th century America. We have Arthur Link, who idolized him in his book America in the 20th Century, Frank Fradel, who had written 2 volumes on Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal, and James McGregor Burns, who has written about him as The Lion and the Fox.
Woodrow Wilson had much of prattle and little of practice, whereas here was a man who had more of practice and less of theory. So from that point of view, we see that Franklin Delano Roosevelt could quickly chalk out a program for tackling the economic and political situation of the world. And this program that he inaugurated during his presidency is known as the New Deal measures. New Deal measures is very much in line with the entire progressive program of Square Deal, New Freedom, etc. entirely. And it justifies the state action in private business, private sector.
So, sir, how do you relate these New Deal movement with the earlier progressive movements?
I relate in this sense that they are all analogous, connected to each other. The theoretical justification of Theodore Roosevelt was similar to the theoretical justification of FDR, that they were out to save America from economic collapse. That was one thing. And try to strike a balance between prosperity and poverty, between agriculture and business, and between abandonment of poorer people, their marginalization and their restoration. These were the areas marked out even by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and before him Woodrow Wilson, and before him Theodore Roosevelt. So he was very much in line with the progressive program, basically to bring in social justice. That is the main purpose to America, which had vanished due to the selfishness of the capitalists and some of the crude presidents, naive presidents like Hoover and Coolidge before him. The first thing that we see is this, that he justifies state initiative, justifies federal initiative in this matter, that when the people are selfish, the government had to come in. And
So I have a question, sir. But was it necessary for the state to interfere in the New Deal measures? Intervene themselves?
Considering the bleak situation in the United States at that time, I think that some kind of state action was necessary, because it was going from bad to worse, going downhill absolutely, as no light at the end of the tunnel was seen. Therefore, if this was allowed to continue, drift any further, then perhaps United States would be splintered, as it were. So here, even people thought that there was some federal action necessary, and somebody who would be wise enough to stem the rot. And how that would be done was left to the president they had chosen. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew his business very well. First of all, he started minimizing the difference between wealth and poverty by federal taxes. FDR also thought that agriculture needed once again some push-up, and he accordingly passed certain measures which would help the restoration of agriculture in American economic life. And for that, of course, he had passed several acts to give a better deal to the agricultural people and also to laboring classes. The Wagner Acts and the other act is the Fair Deal to Laboring Classes. These acts were passed during his time. The next thing that he had done was also to strengthen social securities for the women, children, old people, and the poor. For that, he had decided that social security should be increased and guaranteed to the less fortunate people, deprived people. And how to do that, or the program, that was the main crux of the matter. How to do this? He decided on heavy federal spending. that government subsidies should come to put a floor under the collapsing industries and collapsing agriculture. So heavy federal spending was allowed. Subsidies were doled out. Loans were given to business also. So heavy public spending had taken place during this time. But now I enter into the next phase where there was loss of support for his program. His entire National Recovery Administration, NRA, was rejected by the Supreme Court. The judges saw that it was actually a kind of megalomaniac attempt by FDR in the name of justice to expand his own activity and power. So the conservatives in the Supreme Court, they were those who were in favor of trusts and monopolies, favor of state rights, who actually held the industrial despotism in the country. They were all the spokesmen of those classes. Therefore, they thought that here was a person who was expanding his power in the name of social justice and making too much of federal action, and that would destroy the private rights of life, liberty, and property in the United States. Therefore, there was strong objection. Entire NRA was cancelled by the Supreme Court. And then also, there was somewhat thoughtless spending, public spending, and not well-planned public spending by him. And therefore, there was some loopholes also from the point of view of administration. So, loopholes were there, people's opposition was there, unrest was there in the country, and political trade unions had become powerful. American Federation of Labor, Knights of Labor, they are up against arms against FDR's measures for the part one of his New Deal programs. But even then, we come to the next stage when he again wins the election. Though he was so much criticized and Supreme Court opposed him, trade unions had opposed him, nevertheless he won the election. Possibly, my hunch is that they didn't get a better person than FDR at that time. So though there was a lot of criticism, but he was re-elected with equal number of votes. That shows his popularity as a president. People believed in him. Main thing is people believed in him, that he was a true Democrat, that would work for the good of the people, that would work for the good of the American nation, were taken for granted. That credibility was a big thing in his winning the next election in 1936. So from 1936 to 40, to the brink of the Second World War, he was president, and during this period he became clever, wiser. What he did during this period was that he, first of all, he wanted to root out the opposition in the Supreme Court. So very cleverly, he got many of these old judges unseated and got his own people to be the justices in the Supreme Court. So that was a clever maneuver by him. This was one step. Second step that we see during this period is that he went into direct talks with the trade unions. Particularly, he invited American Federation of Labor and Knights of Labor, organizations like that, and discussed the program. And he promised that he would put a floor under the wages and a ceiling above the hours of work. He assured that to the trade unions. And therefore, the trade unions would do the opposition as well. And social securities now were very clearly audited and genuinely distributed among the marginal people. So all these things this is the period when there is not so much of ideology, but practice which mattered. And he was being very practical and very wise, and he absolutely accurately implemented his program. So he was phenomenally successful. During the second New Deal era is more successful than his first New Deal measures between 1832-36. 36-40, I think, is a triumph of FDR from that point of view. And he would have then left White House, but then came the Second World War.
The Second World War was a military conflict much larger in scale than the First World War. Between 1939 and 1945, it engaged most of the world's major nations, split into two opposing military alliances, the Allies and the Axis. The start of the war was generally held to be on the 1st of September 1939, with the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany, and subsequent declarations of war on Germany by most of the countries in the British Empire and Commonwealth, and by France. Many countries were already at war before this date, such as Ethiopia and Italy in the Second Italo-Abyssinian War, and China and Japan in the Second Sino-Japanese War. Nations which were not initially involved joined the war later.
United States was standing aloof because she was safe in the new world in her splendid isolation. She need not have bothered to join the Second World War. So the World War went on for some time. It was seen that Hitler was becoming victorious. Paris was burning. Russia was checkmated. UK V2 bombing had taken place. So there were dire consequences of this kind of war. And when these things went on, and when Japan was seen capturing Pacific islands one after the other, Philippines was threatened, Hawaii was threatened, Haiti was threatened, Guam was threatened. So America took alarm that the Pacific possessions were going Japan way. And very soon there will be Pearl Harbor.
In a state of total war, the major participants placed their entire economic, industrial and scientific capabilities at the service of war effort, erasing the distinction between civilian and military resources. Over 70 million people, the majority of them civilians, were killed, making it the deadliest conflict in human history. The war involved movement and mobilization of over 100 million military personnel. The war was fought not only with improved weapons but also with a highly innovative strategy. Warfare on land was complemented with war at sea and in the air. In the last stages of the war, two radically new weapons were introduced: the long-range rocket and the atom bomb. In 1945, the war ended in a victory for the Allies. The Soviet Union and the United States of America subsequently emerged as the world's superpowers.
United States always had heavy stake in Continental Economics. They had also, during the First World War, they had given a lot of loans to many of the countries for their reparation. And then she was demanding her money with interest back. For that, she was nicknamed Uncle Sam and criticized very much. So these loans had to be retrieved at any cost. And America had produced so much under big business and the industrial wares that they had produced, military hardwares that they had produced. They had to sell them in the world market. And therefore, they needed the continental market very much for these things. And last of all, of course, one can say that ideologically also, they are absolutely wedded to restoration of democracy in the world and balance of power between democracy and totalitarianism. Now the world was under the grip of totalitarians, so democrats must be united to challenge it. And there was always tacitly some kind of balance of power to be struck. Otherwise, the whole world would be under the hegemony of the totalitarians. If Hitler was totally successful, then God knows what would have happened. There will be ghosts at noon. So Americans are afraid. So ideological commitment was also a factor.
All right. And sir, what were the consequences of the United States participation in the Third World War?
American factor was the main factor which decided the Second World War. Without her participation in the late hours, the Allied bloc couldn't have won the battle against Hitler or Mussolini or Tojo. It was impossible. But because of the American participation with full swing, the world went the other way around and Allied people were victorious. And then they had just produced the atom bomb in the United States, thanks to Oppenheimer and all. And they had already experimented with the atom bomb in the deserts of Nevada. And they were looking for an opportunity to utilize it against some enemy to see its destructive power. And just then the Second World War was on the closing point, and they hurled the bombs on Japan, on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And people could see the devastation that could be caused by the atom bombs. Both the cities were on fire. The fire could be seen from miles away, as if 1,000 suns had burst open. That was the kind of thing. And then 3 generations of people had been maimed, mutilated by the radioactive reaction of the atom bomb. And that immediately stopped Japan from moving any further. Hitler, he suddenly felt cornered. When Americans came out with the atom bomb, Hitler was closeted, and he found that he was going to be defeated. Therefore, he committed suicide. So one by one, the big powers were being defeated. And ultimately, the World War was won by the Allied bloc, thanks to Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The consequence was that a great victory for the Allied bloc, world made safe for democracy, and that democracy had triumphed against totalitarianism, and a perfect balance of power had been struck.
In this episode, Dr. Chittobroto Palit has dwelt upon the evolution of the USA between the 2 world wars. His lecture began with the First World War. He discussed the economic depression of the 1930s in the United States of America and the world at large in the aftermath of the First World War. Dr. Palit then discussed the contribution of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had combined policies of social justice with principles of democracy to bring about stability in American life. He also discussed the New Deal measures of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which unleashed an economic drive on the part of the US government on an unprecedented scale. Although Franklin Delano Roosevelt was generally a popular figure, not all his actions were free from criticism. FDR weathered internal criticism successfully, but he was caught in the quagmire of the Second World War. A combination of economic and military factors compelled President Roosevelt to drag the USA into the war. Of course, all this was done in the name of making the world safe for democracy. Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not live to see the end of the Second World War, but it was the United States of America which effectively brought the war to an end by dropping deadly atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. After the war, the United States of America claimed its position as one of the 2 superpowers.